Ashkam Manor had learned the sound of silence. Clocks ticked through empty halls. Fireplaces burned for no one. Even the servants spoke in whispers. After years of refusing company, Duke Julian Evermont finally advertised for a governess and household manager, not because he wanted companionship, but because his estate was slowly falling into ruin. Among the applicants came Margaret Rosewood, exhausted from days of travel, 4 children in tow, and only enough money left for one last chance. Before she could present her references, she stopped herself. "Your Grace, before you hire me, there's something you should know." The Duke waited. "I come with 4 children." The servants exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone expected rejection. Instead, Julian answered quietly, "Good." He looked toward the silent staircase. This manor has been empty far too long. For the first time in years, someone smiled inside Ashkam Manor. That evening, 6-year-old Benjamin wandered into the library, curled beside the Duke's chair, and fell asleep without meaning to. Without thinking, Julian draped his own coat over the sleeping boy. A footman saw it happen. The cold Duke had shown kindness. Something impossible had just begun. As Margaret unpacked her room, she placed her late husband's silver music box on the dresser. Outside her window, someone was watching the manor. Slowly, Ashkam Manor began to feel like a home again. Oliver asked endless questions, so many that even the stern old butler eventually gave in and answered them. Emma quietly sketched the gardens, the servants, and finally the Duke himself, though she never let him see. Benjamin insisted on eating breakfast wherever Julian ate, dragging his small chair down the hall each morning, until a footman simply gave up and set a permanent place for him. Lucas stayed apart from it all, arms crossed, certain no wealthy nobleman could ever truly care about them. Margaret, meanwhile, worked. She reorganized neglected household records, aired out rooms that hadn't been opened in years, and earned the staff's respect without ever demanding it. Even the gardeners noticed. Flowers bloomed where nothing had been tended in a long while. One rainy afternoon, Emma left a drawing behind in the study by accident. Julian picked it up before a servant could throw it away. It showed him smiling, Benjamin beside him. He stared at it for a long moment. He could not remember the last time he had smiled like that. Genuinely, without effort. That night, instead of setting it aside, he hung the drawing on the wall of his study, where he would see it every morning. Lucas noticed the small changes before anyone said a word about them. He noticed the Duke slowing his pace so Benjamin could keep up. He noticed Emma no longer flinching when Julian entered a room. He said nothing, but he watched closely, waiting for the moment it would all prove false. Margaret noticed something else, how the manor's stiff formality was softening at the edges. The dining hall, once silent, now held the clatter of children's voices. Even the old housekeeper had started humming while she worked. She told herself not to read too much into it. A duke was still a duke. Kindness toward children did not mean kindness would last. But she found herself watching him too. The quiet way he listened when Oliver rambled on about beetles, or the way he'd once caught Benjamin before he tumbled down the front steps, without seeming to think about it at all. Late one evening, passing the study, she saw the drawing on his wall and stopped in the doorway. "You kept it," she said softly. Julian looked up, almost caught. It seemed a shame to lose it. She said nothing more, but something in her chest loosened, just slightly, the smallest permission to hope. The next morning, a servant discovered fresh, muddy footprints beneath Margaret's bedroom window. Nothing had been taken. Someone had only wanted to know what she kept inside. Trust, slowly, began to replace fear. Julian found himself drawn further into the children's lives, not by obligation now, but by something closer to want. He taught Lucas fencing, not to make the boy obedient, but to give him something he'd been missing: confidence. Lucas resisted at first, arms folded, jaw set, certain this was just another performance. But Julian never raised his voice, never mocked a missed step, and after the third lesson, Lucas stopped waiting for the moment the kindness would end. He helped Oliver rescue an injured foal that had gotten tangled in wire near the stables, kneeling in the mud beside the boy for over an hour until the animal calmed. Oliver talked the entire time, about hooves, about horses, about nothing at all, and Julian, to his own surprise, found he didn't mind. He listened, one quiet afternoon, while Emma sat at the manor's long-neglected piano and played for the first time in years. She was shy about it, glancing at him between phrases, but he said nothing except, "Don't stop," and so she didn't. Benjamin had taken to calling him "Your Grace" one moment and almost family the next, as though he hadn't decided which one was true yet. Julian never corrected him. The servants noticed the shift before anyone spoke of it aloud. The dining room, once a place of careful silence, now carried the sound of overlapping voices and small arguments over who got the last roll. One evening, something happened that hadn't happened in years. The Duke laughed. Only once, short and unguarded, but the whole table heard it, and for a moment everyone simply stared, as if witnessing something rare. Margaret watched all of it from the edges, the way she watched everything, carefully, without letting herself believe too much too fast. But it was becoming harder not to see the man underneath the title. Not cruel, not distant, simply a widower who had buried his heart alongside his wife and never quite found his way back to it. She began to understand grief could look like silence, just as easily as tears. Late one evening, long after the household had gone to sleep, Julian came down to the study for a book he'd forgotten and found the door to the sewing room ajar. Inside, by a single candle, Margaret sat mending torn servant uniforms, needle moving steadily, a small pile of finished shirts folded neatly beside her. He paused in the doorway, unnoticed. "You don't have to do that yourself," he said finally. "There's a girl for mending." Margaret didn't look up right away. She had a fever. "I didn't want the staff going without clean uniforms because of it. It's midnight. I know what time it is, Your Grace." He almost smiled at that. He stepped further into the room, glancing at the neat stitches, the quiet efficiency of it. No complaint, no expectation of thanks, just a task she'd decided needed doing. "You could have told me," he said. "I would have sent for someone from the village." It didn't need to be a production. She finally looked up at him. It just needed doing. He said nothing for a moment, watching her in the candlelight, the tired set of her shoulders, the care she still put into work no one would ever notice or praise. It struck him harder than he expected. He had known beautiful women, accomplished women, women trained from birth to charm a room. None of it had ever moved him the way this did. A woman mending shirts alone at midnight, expecting nothing in return. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for all of it. Not just tonight." Margaret's hands stilled on the fabric. "You don't need to thank me for doing my work, Your Grace. I'm not thanking the governess," he said. "I'm thanking you." She held his gaze a moment longer than was proper, then looked back down at the needle, though her hands didn't quite return to their steady rhythm. Julian left without the book he'd come for. 2 days later, a sealed letter arrived from London. Inside, an unfamiliar hand made a single, cold claim. Margaret Rosewood had no legal right to remain at Ashkam Manor. The letter sat unopened on Julian's desk for a full day before he could bring himself to read it. When he finally did, the claim inside meant nothing legally. A distant cousin of Margaret's late husband, testing whether grief had left her too tired to fight for what was hers. Julian's solicitor dismissed it within the hour, but the timing gnawed at him. Someone was watching this household closely enough to know exactly when to strike. He said nothing to Margaret about how unsettled it left him. Instead, life continued, until something larger arrived to test them both. An earl came to call. Lord Pemberton, wealthy, respectable, recently widowed himself, in need of a woman to manage his estate and tame his 3 unruly daughters. He had heard of Margaret's quiet competence through mutual acquaintances, and he made his intentions plain within the first quarter hour of tea. "I am not a romantic man, Mrs. Rosewood," he said. "But I am a practical one. You would want for nothing. Your children would want for nothing." Margaret sat very still, the offer settling over her like a weight she hadn't expected to carry today. Security, stability, no more wondering whether tomorrow held enough. Everything she had prayed for since her husband died. She told him she would consider it. Julian heard of the proposal that same evening, from a servant who hadn't meant it as gossip. He said nothing to Margaret. He believed, had always believed, that love worth having was love freely chosen, not love cornered into staying. If she wanted the Earl's security, he would not stand in her way, however much it cost him to watch her walk toward it. His silence, though, was not what Margaret needed. To her, it read as indifference, proof that whatever she'd imagined growing between them these past weeks had only ever existed in her own hope. She began, quietly, to pack. Benjamin found out first and cried himself to sleep that night, refusing to understand why they had to leave a place that had finally started to feel like home. Lucas took it differently, anger instead of tears, and all of it aimed at Julian. "You're just going to let her go?" he demanded, cornering the Duke outside the stables the next morning. "You taught me to fight for what matters. Why won't you fight for her?" Julian had no answer that satisfied either of them. That night, unable to sleep, he passed Margaret's door and heard her voice, low and unsteady, in prayer. He stopped, without meaning to eavesdrop, but he couldn't make himself walk away. She was thanking God for Ashkam Manor. For the first time since her husband's death, she said, her children had felt safe here. Truly safe. Whatever came next, she wanted him to know she was grateful for that much. Julian stood in the dark hallway, a long time after her voice fell silent. He thought of Benjamin, asleep under his coat that first night, of Emma's drawing still hanging in his study, of Lucas learning, slowly, that not every man in a fine coat was cruel, of Margaret mending shirts alone at midnight because it needed doing. He understood, standing there, that he had already lost people he loved once, and had told himself for years that surviving it meant never risking it again. But watching this family walk out of his life would not be surviving anything. It would simply be another kind of losing. He could not bear it. For the first time since his wife's death, Julian Evermont admitted to himself, plainly, that he wanted something enough to fight for it. He did not sleep that night. He spent it instead, deciding what he would say to her in the morning, and knowing, with a certainty that frightened him a little, that silence was no longer a choice he could afford to make. At dawn, Margaret went to fetch her late husband's silver music box from her dresser to pack it away. It was gone. The missing music box changed everything. Margaret searched her room twice, then a third time, refusing to believe it had simply vanished. It hadn't. Someone had taken it deliberately, and within a day, it became clear the theft was only the beginning. That night, a fire broke out in the stables. Grooms shouted, horses screamed, and Julian was among the first to reach the doors, dragging 2 terrified animals free before the roof beam nearest the tack room collapsed. No one was killed, but 3 horses were badly injured, and it took until dawn to be certain the fire hadn't been an accident. Someone had left a lantern where no lantern belonged. 2 days later, the estate steward reported that a set of ledgers detailing the household's finances from years back had gone missing from the study. Nothing else in the room had been touched. Then came the harder blow. A footman, long trusted, was caught accepting money from a stranger in the village in exchange for information about the household, who came and went, what letters arrived, where Margaret kept her belongings. Under questioning, the footman swore he didn't know who the man worked for. He'd been paid only to watch and to talk. Julian began to understand these were not separate misfortunes. Someone had been circling this house for weeks, patient and precise, and Margaret's arrival had somehow set all of it into motion. The children, without meaning to, became the ones who pieced it together. Lucas, walking back from the stables one evening, overheard two men near the property line speaking low and fast. He caught only fragments, a date, a name he didn't recognize, and twice, unmistakably, the words, "the music box." He ran the whole way back to tell Julian, breathless, no longer angry, only afraid. Emma remembered something too, hesitant at first, unsure if it mattered. Weeks earlier, she'd seen a figure leaving Margaret's room through a servant's corridor rarely used, moving quickly, careful not to be seen. She hadn't thought much of it then. She thought of nothing else now. Oliver, who forgot very little of what he overheard, recalled a conversation from his very first week at the manor. Two grooms murmuring about old papers hidden where music sleeps, a phrase that had meant nothing to a boy obsessed with beetles and horses. It meant everything now. Julian sat with all three accounts laid out before him, like pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand the shape of. The fire, the ledgers, the bribed footman, the missing box. None of it added up to simple theft. This was never about money, he told Margaret, the two of them alone in his study, long after the household had gone quiet. Someone has been hunting that music box specifically, for a long time, I think. Longer than you've been here. Margaret's hands were folded tightly in her lap. It was my husband's. He left it to me before he died. I never thought. She stopped, shook her head. I don't understand what could be inside it worth all this. Neither do I, Julian admitted, but I intend to find out. There was no formality left between them in that moment. No employer, no governess, no duke and widow separated by rank. Only two people who had both lost someone, both frightened for the children they loved, both determined not to lose anything else. I'll help you search, Margaret said. Whatever this is, I want to know. Julian looked at her for a long moment. You don't have to. I know. Her voice was steady. I'm choosing to. They began that night, working side by side through old estate records, servants' logs, anything that might explain who wanted the box badly enough to burn down a stable for it. Hours passed. The candle burned low. At some point, their shoulders were nearly touching over the same ledger, and neither of them moved away. It was, Julian realized, the first time in years he hadn't faced trouble alone, not as a duke protecting his household, not as a widow protecting her children, as partners. Just before midnight, a horse collapsed at the front gate, its rider barely clinging to consciousness, a stranger, bloodied, sent from miles away. With his last breath, the dying messenger managed only one sentence. That night, neither of them sleeping, the man's final words repeating between them, like something too heavy to set down. Your husband died protecting the Duke. It made no sense. And yet it explained too much to be dismissed. By morning, they had a name from the messenger's coat pocket, a solicitor's card, water-stained but legible, belonging to a man in London who had once handled correspondence for Margaret's late husband. Julian sent word immediately, along with instructions to search the missing footman's belongings one final time before he was handed over to the magistrate. It was Emma, of all people, who found the answer first. Sitting with the music box's twin, a smaller carved box Margaret had kept separately, a gift from her husband early in their marriage, Emma noticed the base didn't sit flush with the sides. She showed Julian, who ran his fingers along the seam and found a hidden catch, cleverly disguised in the scrollwork. Inside was a false bottom, and inside that, folded tightly enough to survive years of hiding, were letters, estate maps, treasury records, and signed confessions. They spent the whole afternoon reading them, and by the end, the manor felt like a different house entirely. Margaret's husband, it turned out, had not died in the carriage accident she'd always been told. He had been investigating, quietly and at great personal risk, the death of Julian's father, the previous duke, years before Julian himself had ever suspected anything but grief. The letters detailed months of careful work, financial discrepancies buried in the estate's books, a pattern of theft disguised as bad harvests and failed investments, and finally, proof that the old duke's death had not been the accident everyone believed. The name behind it all was one Julian had trusted without question for most of his life. His longtime steward, the man who had run this household since before Julian could walk its halls, who had taught him to ride, who had stood beside him at his father's funeral and later his wife's, had orchestrated the theft, and when the old duke grew close to discovering it, had arranged his death and let an innocent groundskeeper hang for the crime. Margaret's husband had uncovered the truth. He'd gathered the evidence carefully, meaning to bring it to Julian directly. But before he could, he was killed, made to look like an accident, just as the old duke had been. And the evidence was hidden inside the one place no one thought to look. A widow's grief, carried inside a music box she never stopped keeping close. Julian sat with the papers in his hands for a long time, saying nothing. "Everything I believed about my father's death," he finally said, "was a lie, for years, and the man who lied to me was the one I trusted most in this world." Margaret reached for his hand without thinking, the way she might have reached for one of her children in pain. "I'm so sorry. Don't be." His voice was rough. "Your husband died trying to give me the truth. He died protecting a man he'd never even met." He looked at her properly then. "I owe him a debt I can't repay." Margaret's eyes filled, but there was something steadier in her grief now than there had been in a long time. She had spent years mourning a husband whose death felt senseless, unclaimed by any purpose. Now she understood. He had died doing something that mattered, protecting a family he would never live to see, guarding a truth greater than himself. "I mourned him as a man who left us too soon," she said quietly. "Now I can mourn him as a man who was brave. That's not nothing, Julian. That's everything." It was the first time she had used his given name. He didn't correct her. Instead, he took her hand properly in both of his. "Then let us finish what he started. Together. Whatever it costs." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes but not letting go. Together. They spent the rest of that night, deciding how to bring the evidence before those who could act on it. Quietly enough not to warn the steward. Carefully enough to make certain nothing could be buried a second time. Neither of them noticed, in their focus, that the study window had been left slightly open to the cold night air. By morning, Benjamin was gone from his bed. A single note, left in his place, bore only one line. To silence them forever, the steward had taken the boy. No one waited to be rescued. Margaret's scream when she found Benjamin's empty bed brought the entire household running. But it was the children, not the servants, who moved first. Lucas was already pulling on his boots before Julian reached the nursery, his face set with a calm that hadn't been there months ago. The calm of a boy who had learned, from fencing lessons and quiet patience, that fear didn't have to mean helplessness. "You taught me to think before I swing," Lucas said, meeting Julian's eyes. "So let's think. Where would he take him?" Emma spoke next, her voice shaking but sure. "The old servants' corridor. I saw someone use it before. It comes out near the east wall. If he knows the manor that well, he'd know passages we don't." Oliver, still in his nightshirt, was already dragging out an old estate map he'd taken to keeping under his bed since the fencing lessons began. "The hunting lodge," he said suddenly. "I saw his carriage there once, weeks ago, when Julian took me riding past the old boundary. I didn't think anything of it. I should have." Julian looked at the three of them, really looked, and felt something shift in his chest. These were not children hiding behind adults anymore. They were his family, and they were fighting for one of their own. "Then that's where we go," he said. Margaret refused to be left behind, despite every instinct in Julian telling him to keep her safe within the manor's walls. "He's my son," she said, already pulling on her cloak. "I am not standing in a hallway while someone else brings him home." Julian didn't argue. He simply nodded, understanding that some kinds of courage couldn't be reasoned out of a person, only stood beside. They rode out before full light. Julian, Margaret, Lucas insisting he come, and a handful of trusted grooms who'd proven their loyalty beyond doubt. The lodge sat half-collapsed at the edge of the eastern woods, abandoned by the family for a generation. Exactly the kind of place a man confident no one remembered it would choose to hide. They found the steward's carriage first, tucked behind a fallen wall. Then, and it was over faster than any of them expected. Julian pulled Benjamin into his arms the moment the boy was free, and for once made no effort to hide how badly his hands were shaking. "I knew you'd come," Benjamin whispered into his shoulder. "I told him you would." They brought the steward back to Ashkam in chains, along with every letter, ledger, and confession needed to lay the whole conspiracy before Parliament within the week. The truth, once spoken aloud in front of men who could not ignore it, spread quickly. The old Duke's name was cleared. The wrongly hanged groundskeeper's family received, at last, an apology, 2 decades too late. The steward would face the full weight of the law. That evening, after the house had finally gone quiet again, Julian found Margaret standing at the edge of the garden, watching the children chase fireflies, as though the last day hadn't happened at all, as though children simply knew, better than anyone, how to return to joy. "Years ago," Julian said quietly, coming to stand beside her, "I thought losing my wife was the end of my life." He looked toward Lucas, laughing at something Emma said, toward Oliver, trying and failing to catch a firefly in his cupped hands, toward Benjamin running barefoot through the grass, as though nothing had ever tried to take him away. "Now I realize," Julian said, "it was only the end of the life I was meant to leave behind." Margaret's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. She didn't trust herself to answer right away. After a long moment, she finally whispered, "I don't know whether there's room in this house for us forever." Julian didn't answer her that night in the garden. He only took her hand and told her to trust him a little longer. 3 days later, he gathered the entire household into the manor's grand hall. Every servant, every groom, every soul who had watched this family slowly bring Ashkam back to life. Margaret had no idea why until she walked in and saw all of them standing there, and saw Julian waiting at the center of the room, and understood, all at once, that this was not an ordinary evening. He didn't wait for silence. He simply crossed the room to her, in front of everyone, and knelt. "You came here, asking only for work," he said, his voice carrying easily in the hush that had fallen. "A position, a wage, somewhere safe for your children to sleep." Margaret's hand rose to her mouth. "Instead," Julian said, "you gave this house back its soul." A few of the older servants were already wiping their eyes. Margaret couldn't speak at all, but Julian wasn't finished. Before she could answer, he turned first to the children, because he'd decided, in the days since the garden, that this proposal belonged to all 5 of them, not just to her. To Lucas, who stood a little apart as he always had, arms crossed but no longer guarded. "May I earn the privilege of guiding you into manhood." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Margaret's heart clenched, before he finally said, steady and certain, "You already have." To Emma, whose drawing still hung in his study, where he saw it every morning, "May I always be the first to hang your drawings." Emma didn't answer in words. She simply crossed the room and hugged him, and Julian held her the way he wished someone had held him at her age. To Oliver, still full of questions no one else had the patience for, "Will you promise to keep asking impossible questions?" Oliver grinned. "Only if you'll keep trying to answer them." Finally, Julian turned to Benjamin, who had not let go of his sleeve since the night at the hunting lodge. "May I have the honor," Julian asked, "of being your father?" Benjamin didn't hesitate. He threw both arms around Julian's neck, sobbing openly, no longer caring who saw. "I thought you already were." Only then did Julian turn back to Margaret, still kneeling, and reach for her hand. "I have no eloquent speech left," he admitted, and the room laughed softly, some of the tension breaking. "I only know that this house was silent before you came, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure it never is again. Marry me, Margaret. Let this be home, for all of us, forever." Margaret, tears finally spilling over, managed only one word: "Yes." The hall erupted. servants applauding, Benjamin cheering loud enough to startle the chandelier's crystals, Lucas allowing himself, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, to simply smile without guarding it. Months later, Ashkam Manor bore no resemblance to the silent house it had once been. Laughter carried through halls that used to echo with nothing but clocks. Music drifted from the drawing room most evenings, usually Emma at the piano, occasionally Julian attempting a duet badly enough to make everyone laugh. Family dinners stretched long past what was proper, full of Oliver's questions and Benjamin's stories and Lucas's dry, growing wit. The servants no longer whispered through the halls out of fear, only, sometimes, out of habit, before catching themselves and laughing at how unnecessary it had become. In the garden, in the golden hour before supper, Julian often paused simply to watch them. Margaret, laughing at something one of the children had said. Benjamin chasing Oliver through the flower beds the gardeners had finally brought back to life. Emma sketching them all from beneath the old oak tree. Lucas standing nearby with the easy posture of a boy who finally believed he belonged somewhere. Julian understood, watching them, that his title had never been his greatest inheritance. Neither had the estate, nor the wealth, nor the ancient name he carried. This family, the one that had chosen him, as fiercely as he had chosen them, was. On the mantel in the drawing room, the old silver music box still sat where it had been placed the day the truth came to light. No longer a symbol of grief, or of secrets, or of everything it had once cost to keep hidden. Now it stood simply as a reminder that courage and sacrifice and love could echo far beyond the people who first gave them, carrying forward, generation after generation, inside a house that had finally, truly, come home. Thanks for watching. If you loved this story, let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Please like, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New Duke romance drops every week, right here on Duke Tales by Mia.